Hello, I'm Bod Booker and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about a book that is not just out yet, at least at the time of recording, and that is The Fell by Sarah Moss. Now, people who've sort of seen videos of mine before may know that I adore Sarah Moss from from the few books I've read of her so far. Sarah Moss, I just think, is an absolute genius from the bits I've read. So of her books so far, I believe I've read The Tidal Zone, Night Waking, Summerwater and Ghost Wall, and now this book here, The Fell. And so Sarah Moss, as an author, from what I can tell so far from the books I've read of hers, is really very kind of concerned and interested in not only quite dark subject matter sometimes, but often dealing with that subject matter in a way that's really interesting, because she often closes off the environments around her characters in some way. So, for example, in Summerwater, it is a group of people who have all gone on this sort of kind of camping holiday in Scotland, but it's all kind of rained out, so all the characters are sort of trapped amongst each other, and sort of Scotland and particularly sort of rough and rugged landscapes feature quite a lot in her work more generally, and especially in The Fell. And so in Summerwater, these characters are trapped until they basically reach boiling point. In Night Waking, a mother is sort of dealing with her children and sort of is losing sleep and becoming more and more erratic to the point where she kind of lashes out, and particularly against her children and a bit against her husband. You've also got in Ghost Wall these kind of characters again sort of trapped together on this sort of anthropological or sort of archaeological sort of site, and she's really brilliant at capturing that atmosphere of very small areas and the kind of suffocation that comes from being in a small area, particularly like a village or a sort of bottlenecked area in some way. And she's particularly, I think, powerful as well at looking at family relationships, and that's something that comes up again in Summerwater. In Ghost Wall, it's really powerfully done, I think, as well. In the Tidal Zone, it looks a lot at father and daughter and their relationship, and in The Fell, this comes up in a really interesting way. So how I'll sort of preface this again is that there will be some spoilers in this video talking about The Fell. But for the most part, I've tried keeping this as, well, there'll be a bit of an announcement for when we go into spoiler territory. But I'm going to start off by sort of my overall views of the book and just generally how I kind of got on with the book. I should mention it's due out in November, which also, if I'm thinking right, makes it eligible for next year's Booker, and I really hope it makes it there because of this. Because as you may be able to tell, I loved it. And I just think Sarah Moss is brilliant. I think this is genius. So this book is largely a pandemic novel, and particularly a kind of coronavirus lockdown book. And I think what's so clever about it is the way it handles that in a way that doesn't feel hammy. I was really nervous sort of at one point thinking about all of the kind of post-pandemic literature that's going to come out, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot that's brilliant, but I'm also sure there's going to be a lot that is just really naff and really like overblown and really over the top. And particularly, obviously, it's a really dramatic time we're all living in, but I also think if you're not going to do it well, there needs to at least be some critical distance to really think about the effect it's had on us all. The only other writer I've seen do this so far and do it well, I think, has been Ali Smith in Summer, just because of the end of when she was writing Summer was just the sort of the pandemic was kind of coming in. So she sort of wove it into the final bit of the book in a way that I thought was really powerful. And in The Fell, we are looking at, again, a pandemic kind of landscape. So all of the characters, when we first meet them, are in lockdown. They're fairly newly in lockdown, but they are really struggling. And this, again, is not a spoiler because this kind of comes up quite early in the book, but we learn that the characters are just sort of feeling quite suffocated and trapped. And the writing style really starts getting to that, because the characters go off on these really meandering thoughts that are so brilliantly rendered, because it's exactly for me how actually early lockdown felt, where you're doing one task and your mind starts deviating off over here to sort of panic and worry and kind of thinking like, oh, am I gonna be able to get to the shops? But if I go to the shops, am I going through a bit of a risk, kind of category here? But then if I don't get any food, am I at more risk, and do I need to be outside? And if I'm not outside, is my mental health going to really struggle? But also, do I want to go out and expose myself to this risk? And it's really well handled, I think. The book, I don't think, takes it for granted that you understand exactly what the pandemic looked like from a British perspective. You know, a lot of the language it uses is very much how sort of the British press, British government were talking about the pandemic. And so I think she does a really good job at kind of decoding that, but in a way that doesn't feel like an information dump. It feels very much like she sort of will say a term and be like, oh, isn't this weird? You know, the characters will reflect on it instead of just sort of say, they said this, which means this. It's always, well, isn't social distancing such a weird term for people to use? Because really that doesn't make any sense. And the characters will sort of go off on these little tangents in a way that I just thought was so compelling and so interesting. And the book, because of this sort of fractured writing style at times, is really quite overwhelming and quite powerful. And it's, I think that's the cleverest thing about this book, is it never really goes into being sentimental or to really being kind of woe is me about any of this. Instead, the characters are scared, they're confused, they're paranoid, they're constantly worried about being found out or anything else like that. And it really, for me, mirrors that real unease that lots of people felt right at the beginning and are still feeling now, as we are sort of in this stage of the pandemic, with, you know, when is the end? when is that coming? And I just think it's a really well handled book. And before I go into spoilers, I'll just talk a little bit about the overall plot, because I realise 7 minutes in, I've not covered that. And so the plot of this book is largely that these characters are all under, you know, in lockdown in this small village. And one day, one of the characters decides that she's been trapped too long and she goes for a walk. And this is in the evening, and she walks across the fell, hence the title of the name, the title of the book, and gets, you know, kind of goes missing. And it kind of then leads to a search operation for her. And I think this book does this so cleverly, because that is actually, again, a sort of bottlenecked environment. It's quite a simple plot in that sense. You know, character goes missing, then there's a search operation. But I think what the book does so well is sort of turn that on its head, kind of thinking, what does it look like when someone goes missing during a pandemic? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the spoilers section. But just before I get to spoilers, I just really want to highly recommend this book. I think it is absolutely fantastic. And please be warned that we are now about to go into spoiler territory. And so, first kind of spoiler, I guess, to mention, and even that, it kind of feels that you probably could have guessed from some of what I was talking about before, but the characters are really terrified about being found out, because they're in a pandemic, and they're really worried constantly about finances as a result. If someone were to call the police on, you know, to help find this missing person, they would get charged, or, you know, the person would be charged. This mother would be fined, and at the time they're talking about the fine being about £20,000 sterling, British pounds, and you know, it sort of remarks in the book that that's pretty much her average, you know, that's her annual wage. She's already struggling day to day to kind of get her finances in order, and that would not help. And we see this woman really sort of scrabbling to find enough money for everything. In many ways, she's constantly quite paranoid. She has been put on furlough from her cafe job. This is Kate, the main character, who goes on the walk. And yeah, so she's really terrified because she thinks, well, I'm on furlough, but if I lose that furlough or that job, or if something else changes, I'm screwed. I can't do anything. In the meantime, we have her son, who is at home waiting for her. I think he's called Mark, yes. And he is really worried about her, but also feels quite powerless because he doesn't want to call anybody or alert anybody to the fact that she's missing, because that might then incur this fine. But also he needs to have someone looking out for her because her life is at risk. You know, she could very easily get cold and potentially die out on the fell. She could be in trouble. She could have been abducted. Anything could have happened. And so he needs to notify people. But if he's not going to call the police, who does he call? And don't say Ghostbusters, which is what my brain was going for there. Who does he call instead? Well, he goes over to the sort of his grandmother's house and is sort of trying to knock. But in doing so, he's got a plastic bag covering his hand, so that he can ring the doorbell and open the gate without it without passing anything along. He's wearing his mask, he's kind of fully covered, and there's this real terror of these characters really trying to kind of understand how to approach this, because nothing feels normal to them anymore. There's no real way they can approach this whole scenario without feeling like they're breaking the rules themselves and will also incur this fine. Kate, who goes on this walk, is so like her all of her sections are in this really detailed stream of consciousness that feels so sporadic. I mean, maybe it isn't the best comparison, and especially because I know that some people really didn't get on that well with this novel, but something like Duck's Newburyport came to mind quite a lot during this part of the book, because her thoughts are really doing this, and particularly when she's out on the fell, and we kind of get this really detailed insight into her fears about this, you know, being in the dark, and she seems to have sort of broken a leg or injured herself in some way, and she is sort of telling herself like, no, I can't go to sleep, I can't go to sleep. And at some point she starts talking to a raven, and she is convinced that this raven is also kind of giving her this advice of, don't go to sleep yet, you can't do this, like you're going to die. And it's so brilliantly done because it's so suffocating, and your eye is following this book along the page, following each word on the page, and it's sort of just so fast, and it kind of all comes at you all at once. It's so intense, and her thought patterns then are really interestingly mirrored or sort of contrasted with her son, who, in trying to deal with all of this intensity, almost shuts down, and his sentences become a lot shorter. They're a lot more focused on sort of, where is she? She doesn't normally do this. What do I do? Every other character seems to be losing their minds, and their thoughts are everywhere. And I think this is the really clever thing about this book, and something I really appreciate about Sarah Moss is that the form and the plot often go hand in hand, and so the idea of this book around this kind of disquiet and unease is mirrored in this language that's sort of all over the place, and I just think this book is exceptional. Particularly for something that's about 150, 160 pages, this book just sort of rattles through, and I just think it's genius. I think this is an absolutely brilliant book. I think this is one of the rare books that I think has maybe sort of shrug off some of my cynicism about how good a pandemic novel can be. And I think it's really, pardon me, it's really well worth checking out. So I really do urge you, when this book comes out in November, to give it a go. If in the meantime, if you're not able to get your hands on it, or if you want to check out anything else by Sarah Moss, the other 4 books that I've mentioned by her, I think are all well worth checking out, and I'll include links to them below. But those are Ghost Wall, Summerwater, The Tidal Zone, and Night Waking, which I just think are all brilliant in their own way. So dark and so gripping intense, but I think she is just such a brilliant writer, and I feel really glad to have been given an advance copy of this by NetGalley, and have therefore been able to read it in advance, and I'm so grateful for that, because this is a brilliant book, and I'm excited to see what the reception is when it comes out properly in November, particularly given that this book, by then, what will November look like for us in terms of the pandemic? But I really do urge you to check it out. Please do let me know if there are any other books that you know of that are pandemic related, either this pandemic or another one. 2 good ones that come to mind from previous pandemics are Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, and Emma Donoghue's book that I have forgotten the name of, but it is The Pull of the Stars, which is set in 1918. And is also brilliantly handled in terms of that and the kind of intensity around this. Anyway, I've been Bob Booker. Take care and enjoy your reading. Bye bye.